Hi everyone, Jason here from Spiritualbabies.net. You've joined us again for the Haftarah Half Hour. This week we're looking for the Haftarah of Tazria, which is 2 Kings 4:42 through 5:19, and we're joined again, as we are every week, by Rabbi Joshua Neely. Welcome back, Rabbi Neely.
Good to be back and online again.
And so we're going to jump straight in, I think. Can you give us a rundown of what's happened up to this point? We've got a man coming here from a place we probably haven't heard of.
We've had at least one incident before, the whole bear incident, which gets people worked up. But in this case, we are dealing now with the prophet Elisha, who took over for the prophet Elijah. And Elisha, in his early career, is marked by a number of miraculous events. And this Haftarah is going to give us two of them. And Parashat Tazria has a lot of information that deals with the issue that is commonly referred to as leprosy in English, which of course is not at all what the condition is in the Torah, but it is a useful English stand-in because most people find it difficult to say the word tzara'at. But really tzara'at is a much better word to use because when you think of this as leprosy, it gets very, very confusing because it does not behave like leprosy. So just keep that in mind, that anytime we might say leprosy during our discussion, we're not talking about the very clear and modernly diagnosed and treated condition of leprosy, but we're talking about a spiritual ailment from the ancient world. Before we get going, we should remind everybody who is listening that if they don't see this Haftarah come up all that often on its own, don't be surprised. It is a Haftarah that comes up rarely because of the way the Torah portions are broken down each year. So it doesn't get read out loud that often, but it's still a very interesting story and a very important lead-in, according to the rabbinic interpretation, to the Haftarah for Mitzorah, for its partner, Parasha.
A man came from Baal Shalishah, and he brought the man of God some bread from the first reaping, 20 loaves of barley bread, and some fresh grain in his sack. And Elisha said, "Give it to the people and let them eat." His attendant replied, "How can I set this before 100 men?" But he said, "Give it to the people and let them eat. For thus said the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." So he set it before them, and when they had eaten, they had some left over, as the Lord said. That's finishing up chapter 4 there. I'm wondering, when it says some bread of the first reaping, would this be the first fruits?
No, this is, as it's barley bread, we're dealing with the issue here of the Omer, which is very appropriate because this Haftarah is read during the time of the counting of the Omer. And it may be one of the reasons why they included the sages when they were dividing up the Haftarot, why they included these last few lines of chapter 4, when really the main story is chapter 5, the one that has a much closer connection to the Torah portion. But the barley was the first grain to ripen in the spring, and it was the barley harvest that was the foundation of the Omer that was brought, and it was the barley harvest that tided you over until the wheat harvests began in the early summer, which is marked by Shavuot.
But there's a miracle here, right? He puts down the 20 loaves, but everyone gets enough, and there's some left over.
Well, you know, if you have 100 people and you put down 20 loaves, that means that there's not a lot of, certainly isn't enough for everyone, if you're giving one loaf per person. But Elisha is known, as we'll see again in the next Haftarah, try not to do too many spoiler alerts, but for foretelling there will be more food than expected. And so this and the next Haftarah really work well as bookends on this idea that just because you've counted it doesn't mean it's not enough. In fact, there is a very important teaching in the Talmud and Masechet Brachot talking about blessings, that blessings only come upon things that have not been counted. The idea being that once you have counted it, you have removed the opportunity for a blessing to occur. So if you know you have 5 bushels of grain, you're only going to have 5 bushels of grain. But if you know you have a stack of grain, it may turn out that when you bushel it up, you end up with a lot more than you thought was going to be there. And this notion of allowing a little room, a little bit of space, a little bit of uncertainty in order for blessings and goodness to come in that was unexpected is, I think, a very important mindset for life. Not just constantly counting the pennies, but leaving a little bit of room for things to take a course that may surprise you.
Chapter 5. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, was important to his lord and high in his favor. For through him the Lord had granted victory to Aram. But the man, though a great warrior, was a leper, which we know means he wasn't a leper. But he had an issue. He had a spiritual and physical issue.
Well, there's debate about whether or not Naaman was an actual leper, that we might modernly call a leper, in which case the healing that takes place now is a straightforward healing of a medical illness, or whether or not he was suffering from tzara'at, from a spiritual ailment, in which case we're looking at a spiritual solution. I tend to favor the latter, as does most of our tradition, because the idea being that tzara'at was usually associated with transgressions or attitudes of pride or arrogance or selfishness. Certainly the commander of the army of the king of Aram, especially as we're going to see how he behaves in the next few verses, would be likely candidates for having those types of character flaws. And the solution, which is definitely seen to him as being lowering himself, would seem to take care of that spiritual flaw.
Once, when the Arameans were out raiding, they carried off a young girl from the land of Israel, and she became an attendant to Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "I wish master would come before the prophet in Samaria, and he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went and told his lord just what the girl from the land of Israel said. And the king of Aram said, "Go to the king of Israel. I will send along a letter."
It's unfortunate, obviously, that they have kidnapped this young girl from Israel, and she becomes a slave to Naaman's wife. But she does have some information.
So he set out, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. He brought the letter to the king of Israel. It read, "Now when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent my courier Naaman to you, that you may cure him of his leprosy." When the king of Israel read the letter, he rent his clothes and cried, "Am I God to deal death or give life, that this fellow writes to me to cure a man of leprosy? Just see for yourselves that he is seeking a pretext against me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, he sent a message to the king, "Why have you rent your clothes? Let him come to me, and he will learn that there is a prophet in Israel." Renting your clothes right away, it reminds me of in the Torah portion, I think it was this week's Torah portion, I think it was around verse 45, that if you got this skin complaint, this issue, you tore your own clothes and you were to treat it as if you were in mourning.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a sign of catastrophe. And I don't want to say the funny thing is, but the king of Israel sees this as being a very political move by the king of Aram. He says, "Look, Aram is sending this guy to me just to set me up to fail. And then when I fail to cure his guy, then he's going to attack and say, you refuse to cure him, therefore we're attacking you." Which is what you might call the pot calling the kettle black. That this is the kind of thing that the kings of Israel would do, which is deliberately orchestrate events in order to attack their enemies. But Elisha is saying, look, you don't believe that this can happen, but he didn't ask you to do this. He wasn't asking the king to fix this. He was asking the prophet. He was asking essentially God to fix this. Don't you believe that God can do this? Have him come to me and I'll take care of it.
So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and halted at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a message to him saying, "Go and bathe 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angered and walked away. "I thought," he said, "he would surely come out to me, and would stand and invoke the Lord his God by name, and would wave his hand towards the spot and cure the affected part. Are not the Amana and the Papa, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? I could bathe in them and be clean." And he stalked off in a rage. So he got a huff on because he wasn't coming greeted as this great guy.
Well, and you know, his expectation of what does it mean to have a prophet or a priest do a healing is to have someone come out and go, blah, 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 and you know, whatever utterance they're going to do and wave their hands, and then presto changeo, it's the power of the prophet. But Elisha is working very hard here to make sure that the message that Naaman takes away from this is that God cured him, not Elisha. That it wasn't Elisha's magical hand powers that's doing anything here, that it was God. And to do that, he is distancing himself from the act of curing by saying, look, you go bathe in the Jordan. And again, we see the arrogance of Naaman, saying, well, if it's just a matter of bathing in a river, then I should go bathe in the rivers of my own country. You know, the rivers of Aram are much better than the rivers of Israel. And if you've ever seen the Jordan, you can sort of understand that. The Jordan is beautiful, but it's, if not for the biblical connection, it would not make anyone's top 10 river list in the world. Most of the parts of the Jordan, you could easily throw a rock over it. So he understandably gets upset given his position, his status, and his expectations. But of course, it was his position, his status, and his expectations that got him in trouble in the first place, which is why he's lucky he has good servants.
It kind of reminds me as well of many other parts of when we're reading the Torah, especially when it comes to the sacrifices. There's a physical act involved in a spiritual message. And so while he was expecting this person to come out and, like you said, wave his arms around and do some sort of magic, what we have here is an instance where the person that's initiating the relationship with God in a kind of a transmission with God is asked to physically do something. He's asked to get involved and show that he's willing to be part of that process and not just be the subject of that process.
Exactly. He is not the object of the verb, he has to be the subject of the verb. And that's precisely because the whole point of both the sacrifices and other commandments is that we as individuals connect to God. And although in the sacrifices the priests may be involved as the instruments of that activity, there has to be an intimate connection between the person who is doing the sacrifice and the sacrifice that is being done on their behalf. And here we see it even more clearly. It's not, I'm going to cure you. You need to cure yourself.
And it's not, you need to bathe in the river 7 times. It's, you need to do what I tell you to do. Okay. But his servants came forward and spoke to him. "Sir," they said, "if the prophet told you to do something difficult, would you not do it? Okay. How much more when he has only said to you, bathe and be clean?" So he went down and immersed himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had bidden, and his flesh became like a little boy's, and he was clean. That'd be a great product to have today. Everyone promises it, but it never happens.
No. But it's just such wonderful practical advice. I mean, if he had told you to climb Mount Everest, you would have thought that was worthy to do, and then you would have undertaken it with glee and gusto. But because he asked you to do something simple, you're going to refuse. And sometimes I think people have that attitude towards Torah and the mitzvot. They think that the harder it is, or the more difficult they make it for themselves, that somehow they are being spiritually elevated. When the point isn't about being physically difficult, the point is about the spiritual difficulty of doing what has been asked, of fulfilling the commandments. And even though some commandments can be easy, their fulfillment spiritually can be still very challenging to us. The favorite example that's often used is the issue of shatnez, of not wearing garments that are made of mixed wool and linen. Pretty simple. Just don't wear it. It's not like the clothes are jumping out on us from trees. It's not like all the clothes in the world are made of this mixture, and therefore it's impossible and you have to sew your own. It's pretty simple to check if something has been made with shatnez or not, and to simply wear it. But because it's so simple, many people completely ignore it, that it must not be very important if it's that easy. So, yeah. Again, not a new attitude.
On that subject, when we were going through the Torah portion for that, we came to a conclusion in the show that I did that they were the garments that were made for the priests, and that was why regular people aren't allowed to wear that mix. Have you heard that before?
I've heard that argument. I've also heard the other position, which is they were forbidden from everyone, except they were allowed for the priests in their officiation, which was that it wasn't that the priestly garments came first and then they were prohibited to everyone. It was they were prohibited to everyone, including the priests, but then an exception was made with regards to the priestly garments. Rambam hypothesizes that the wearing of wool and linen may have had some part of talismanic practices in other pagan societies, and that might be why it was prohibited. But on our day and age, where this is not much of an issue either for priests or for other religions that we are surrounded by, it becomes simply an exercise of spiritual discipline, of taking the easy commandments as serious as the hard ones.
I spent a little bit of time looking at it a few years ago, and what's interesting is if you put linen on its own is a very airy and breathable material, and wool is the opposite, and wool retains the heat. But if you put them both together, they cancel each other out, so that it loses its breathability and it loses its heat retention. So kind of funny thing, but science is science. So 15. Returning with his entire retinue to the man of God, he stood before him and exclaimed, "Now I know that there is no God in the whole world except in Israel. So please accept a gift from your servant." But he replied, "As the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept anything." He pressed him to accept, but he refused. And Naaman said, "Then at least let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth, for your servant will never again offer up burnt offerings or sacrifices to any god but the Lord. But may the Lord pardon your servant for this. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow low in worship there, he is leaning on my arm, so that I must bow low in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow low in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord pardon your servant in this." And he said to him, "Go in peace." When he had gone some distance from him...
It just sort of cuts off in this version, doesn't it?
It really does.
What an odd typing. No, it's verse 19. It should finish with, "And he said to him, go in peace."
I think we should probably start back in 13.
I guess probably the difficulty is that maybe in the JPS translation, they use the second half of verse 19 as a lead-in to verse 20. And that may make it awkward in this, because in the Hebrew it's just then he went and he went some way. But the problem is, of course, in verse 20, which is not included in this Haftarah, but is obviously in the next verse of the chapter, is Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, goes running after Naaman and basically says, "Remember how my master refused any payment?"
He was too hasty. Too hasty.
Well, actually, a little compensation wouldn't hurt. Maybe an honorarium of something. And that we'll talk about when we discuss the Haftarah for Mitzorah.
It doesn't go well for him. So going back to 15. So he does what was asked. His skin is all lovely, and he goes back to the prophet, and he's had the revelation. He's seen the physical evidence that there's only one God, and that's the God of Israel, and now he wants to serve that one God. Are these 2 barrelfuls of earth so that he can make an altar in his homeland?
It seems definitely to be a reminder that he is going to only have his worship take place in this clean place, as it were, in something that has not been dedicated or been trampled by the worship of the Aramean gods. And it's very touching that he is making this dedication and that he is trying to explain, my job, my position, I have to go with my master, with the king, when he goes to the Aramean temples. And he's leaning on my arm. So when he bows, I've got to go down with him. I can't stand up while he's bowing down, and I can't refuse to go, or else it just doesn't happen. So he's asking for permission to be able to continue to be there. And of course, Elisha grants him that with his promise of go in peace.
It's interesting for me, and I'm sure for lots of the people that are going to be watching this, because of the way I was brought up in the country I live in, I can really relate to this. So there will be instances where parts of my family who live a Christian lifestyle, oh, that's not even fair. They might not even live a Christian lifestyle, but they still keep the westernized celebrations of Christmas and Easter. So everyone has to be around the table at Christmas, otherwise, it's World War III.
Right. Otherwise, you're not part of the family.
Yeah, that's it. You cut off, cut off from the nation, and there is every year there's a kind of wrestle where, well, I know no one's going to mention any foreign gods because no one's really that religious, but I'm still sitting at Christmas table. There's going to be a Christmas tree, and there's going to be pictures of Santa Claus, and then so I read this and I really feel for the guy because I totally know where it's coming from. And it's a bit of a wrestle. So it's interesting that that's in there. I can't say that the prophet's telling me to go in peace, but it's it's nice to know that there are some instances where God can see that your personal circumstances aren't always your own.
And in many instances, what you're carrying in your heart, even if the outward sign looks wrong, is more important. That's not always the case. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But it is important to remember it's not always so black and white. And clearly Naaman is saying, look, I understand now. And that really is his humility is what's so important here, and why he effected a change in himself. It wasn't just the water, it was the fact that he was willing to do as asked, and he was willing to go into the insignificant waters of the Jordan, that this happened. And when he became like a little boy, he was new and again in his spirit. He realized it wasn't just thank you very much for the healing, here's some money and I'm leaving. It was, I understand now what God is, and I've gotten it wrong my whole life. But his whole life still exists, and he needs to find a way to carry it back with him. And I think part of the reason why Elisha refused the acceptance of the gifts was precisely because he didn't want this to be transactional. He wanted it to be transformative. And he knew that if he accepted gifts, that Naaman would be more prone to see it in the context of his own experiences among the idolatry, which is you pay for the gifts you get or the gifts you want. But instead he said, no, you can take the earth as a sign of what happened here. But I do not want a gift, because what you did is between you and God. And what you will do in serving your king will be between you and God.
As we've been going through these programs, I'm learning an awful lot about how to read the text, and paying attention to small things. So as you said in verse 14, it doesn't say his flesh became clean like a small boy's. It said that his flesh became like a little boy's, and he was clean. I imagine that there is much said about the clean being separate from being, young, soft skin, and that there's a spiritual cleanness or a kind of wholesomeness that also means.
Well, absolutely. There is always a difference in Jewish readings between something that is smooth or soft and something that is tahor, that is ritually clean. And you can have one without being the other. You can have the smoothest, babyest skin in the world and still be ritually impure. And you can be ritually impure and have skin that looks like it went through a couple rolls of sandpaper. And in this particular instance, both are happening. And so, yes, it's definitely significant.
So there were everyone. That was this week's program. Thanks for joining us. Stick around to the end and you'll find out what next week's portion will be and the verses. If you've got comments or questions, please leave them underneath. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the video. Thank you, Rabbi Neely, for joining us again.
Oh, thank you, Jason. Always a pleasure.
And we'll see you boys and girls next week. Bye-bye.